Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Aubrey Reeves, CEO of Business and Arts. Before we begin, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge that while Business and Arts is a national organization with staff in many territories, I am speaking to you from Takaranto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat peoples, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee confederacies, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. All year round, but especially during National Indigenous History Month, we acknowledge all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on these lands. Today, we're excited to talk about real estate in the Canadian arts landscape, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first, I want to say a big thank you to the Speaker Series presenting partner, Power Corporation of Canada, whose support enables us to bring these kind of inspiring discussions to you. We're grateful for Power Corporation's continued support. And I'd also like to thank our supporting partners, Royal Bank of Canada and Arts Consulting Group. Now, just a few housekeeping items. We're happy to have ASL interpretation for today's session. Auto-generated English and French captions can also be turned on your control panel. Only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on today, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box. This session is scheduled for 1 hour. I'm happy now to introduce our moderator for this session, which is Josh O'Kane. Josh is a staff reporter at the Globe and Mail, where he covers the institutions, economics, and policies that underpin arts and culture. His reporting seeks to explain the forces that shape the artistic world, especially as it reckons with new fiscal realities after the pandemic. He's also the author of 2 bestsellers, including Sideways, The City Google Couldn't Buy, which was adapted for the stage as the Dora Maver Moore award-winning play, The Master Plan, and a biography of Nova Scotia musician Joe Plaskett. So welcome, Josh, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Aubrey. I really appreciate the chance to be here and to talk about this subject that I have been thinking about for quite a long time. I've been reporting for the Globe for about 14 years, the past 2.5 specifically focusing on arts and culture and how other factors in the world affect this sector. And one of the things that I found striking was that almost every arts organization I spoke with over the last few years really struggled with space and affording space. It is, in a lot of ways, one of the most important issues affecting everyone in this country, but in a largely nonprofit sector with limited revenue, given the demographics and geographic constraints of our country, obviously there are a lot of issues affecting, arts organizations and artists themselves when it comes to affording real estate. So I spent a few months last year, and are going into this January, researching the topic and trying to find artist created solutions to this issue. And I wound up writing a story that ran in one of our Saturday editions back in January, and I'm delighted to be able to actually bring forth some of the folks that I spoke with for that story to talk about the solutions they've found to kind of allow a greater access to space, both for their organizations as well as for their broader communities. So now I'm going to introduce you to those folks, our panelists, Brian McBay, Hannah Wood, and Robbie Jane. Brian McBay is a leader in the nonprofit arts and culture infrastructure sector with over 20 years experience. He's the founder and executive director of 221A, a Vancouver-based artistic research and cultural space organization. Under his leadership, 221A operates a growing network of over 140,000 square feet across 9 properties that provide space for artists working in research, public art, artist housing, and artist studios. Brian was an honoree of the Power 50 by Vancouver Magazine, recipient of the 2025 Emily Award, and was named a fellow at Salzburg Global Forum. In addition to his role at 221A, Brian has served on a variety of nonprofit and public sector boards, including the BC Arts Council, Chinese Canadian Museum, Vancouver International Film Festival, and the National Gallery of Canada. He is often invited to speak and write on art, policy, and urban development. Hannah Wood is a business owner, accessibility advocate, organizer, urban chicken keeper, and active volunteer. She fills leadership and volunteer roles in several organizations, including Acorn, Justice for Workers, RadStorm Arts Collective, and the Halifax Public Library's Reading Support Program. Hannah is also a supporter and part-time staff member of the Workers Action Center. She graduated from University of Victoria in 2013, but is originally from Fredericton, New Brunswick. Hannah is a disabled person and has worked in accessibility consulting both professionally and in service to provincial and national boards and reviews since 2016. Her personal hobbies include crafting, sewing, and card making. She resides with her partner and 10 chickens in the north end of Jabuktuk, or Halifax. And lastly, we've got Robbie Jane, a highly acclaimed artistic director, versatile director, astute producer, and playful actor. You spent his career reimagining what theater can be, impacting the lives of both audiences and artists alike. With Why Not Theater, Mr. Jane has created over 40 collaborations and performed over 5 continents. Ravi's recent adaptation of the Mahabharata premiered at the Shaw Festival and toured to sellout houses, including at the Barbican Theatre in London and the Lincoln Center in New York. Ravi was awarded the 2012 Pauline McGibbon Award for Emerging Director and the 2016 Canada Council John Hirsch Prize for Direction, and in 2022, the Joanna Metcalf Foundation Performing Arts Prize. He's a graduate of École Jacques Lecoq in France. Thank you for all of our panelists for coming today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So to start, I'm going to ask a question to all of you. Whoever wants to answer first, please just go right ahead. How would you describe the real estate situation for artists and arts organizations in your community? Ravi, you're unmuted, so I'm going to go to you.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'll go first. First of all, thanks so much for hosting this Business and Arts, and happy to be part of this esteemed panel. I would say that the situation is pretty bad. I mean, it depends on also what art you ask. Definitely for dance, it's abysmal. We've lost a lot of spaces where dancers rehearse, where dancers convene. We have a real problem also with live music venues after COVID was a big problem in Toronto. And for theater artists, which I am, it's just becoming increasingly difficult to afford rehearsal spaces, let alone the umbrella of just to live in the city, in the downtown core, or really, which is that barrier is becoming a wider gap in terms of the footprint of downtown. It's just becoming increasingly difficult to live and work as an artist in the city.
Okay, Hannah, curious how things are going for your community.
Also bad. And also thank you for having me. I would say in Nova Scotia in general, including just all across Cape Breton and rural Nova Scotia, there's just a lack of spaces to perform and to do art. And then here in the city, for fine arts, there are some places, but there is a lot of financial difficulties in that being accessed for working class people. So I would say it's hard to access space at all, and then it's hard to affordably access classes and space and materials. And as our city here in Halifax is densifying, and properly so, there's a focus on housing. So any kind of land that is getting opened up is getting developed for housing. And a lot of buildings that used to have other purposes are also being developed for housing. So it's very hard to maintain art spaces or get any new dedicated spaces for arts in that environment.
Okay, Brian, how are things going in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland?
Yeah, I think out west here, I guess I'll first just acknowledge I'm Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory here. And thanks, Josh, as well as Aubrey. Josh, I just want to say quickly, you've talked to a bunch of people. You chose us three, so we feel privileged to be here to come to this conversation. Yeah, I think we are a city master planned without the arts. Let's put it that way. We've lost 400,000 square feet of cultural spaces in a 10-year period. And largely the grant kind of policies haven't been effective in the context of urban planning. And urban planning requires as a priority around arts and culture in order for it to exist in the future. And so we are in a kind of survival state. I think in particular, around housing. There's an extreme kind of situation here. We operate 30 units of artist housing. We had in our 3 weeks of opening those units about 500 applications, and those are highly focused around low-income families, and that need continues to be extreme. And with artist studio spaces and venue spaces, the demand from our end we see declining, but that's partly because housing costs have risen so much. At the same time, government, as Hannah was saying, has put a lot of emphasis on housing. And we've seen that while, for example, the provincial government has said, we're going to add 13,000 new homes to this region by forcing municipalities to build. There hasn't been this question, what is arts and culture space going to look like in the future of those housing? So we're even being able to come to the table and say, what are the tools out there to make sure arts and culture can be in the future of the city? It's still early conversations.
Okay. So Brian, this is a session about solutions to the real estate crisis. And one of the reasons why I wanted to include you is we've been talking for probably almost a year now about land trusts and the project you're working on around a cultural land trust. So I was wondering if you could walk this audience through the land trust idea that you're working on with 221A, and how that builds upon the work you're already doing.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll provide a little bit of history with 221A. We were started by a group of students who graduated from both art and design kind of disciplines. And I think the design element of our work has factored into being able to navigate a lot of urban regulation. And we found ourselves, like, our first home was in Chinatown. We still are operating 4 different spaces in Chinatown, but that neighborhood, of course, very much shaped our reality and how we see urban space and planning. And really, like, we're a group of artists who just collectively wanted to take part in culture, and in doing so, moved into a building. And when we found out we could navigate these spaces, we ended up getting involved in another building with more basically friends to collaboratively rent these spaces. And at the same time, we uncovered the relationships between government and community. And so for Chinatown in particular, I have a history there. I'm 4th generation Chinese Canadian. And we learned about the Chinese Benevolent Association, which are family clans that in the early 1900s, late 1800s, started purchasing properties because private ownership was illegal for Chinese folks. So it was actually a collective form of property ownership. And one of the second building we got involved with was actually owned by a Chinese Benevolent Association. So these are people in their 80s and 90s at the time who were 100% volunteer and who offered rental rates that were probably the lowest in Canada. I don't know, very low rental rates. And I brought my grandmother with me to negotiate the first lease, which was the smartest idea I've ever done in my life, because my grandmother, we ran a restaurant in the neighborhood. So my grandmother kept saying names and then the price just kept dropping. So we ended up, really, you could say 100% of our success relates to social sustainability set up in the past and my family's relationships there. There was a sense that we were doing, nobody knew what art was, and from the perspective of Chinese seniors largely, or who were chain smoking for the most part of these kind of, and but they understood we were doing social good work and educational work, and so there was a openness to working with us. And that's kind of how I think 221A as an organization started to move further away from kind of theoretical experimentation with social and art relationships and more into thinking about how is a city created and who is excluded and who's included within these dynamics. This concept of a land trust partly came up, as a result of thinking about Chinese benevolent associations, which you have to understand 40 buildings or so in Chinatown, Vancouver right now are still owned by these societies. And they're having to now contend with what does that look like in the future. We started to think about co-op associations. And it was the BC Co-op Association in 2013 that sort of got this idea going of, while land trusts are well known for housing, like low-income affordability crisis for housing, they're also known for nature conservancy. Could it be applied to cultural space? And that's where we asked the question. We did a study where we called the idea validation study, asked various artists and arts organizations, and people were very excited about this idea of a kind of common governance model around shared cultural properties, and also using that as a way to leverage financing. And at the same time, underneath all of the questions of real estate, and Josh, feel free to cut me off if I'm going too long, is sort of a bad deal, which is the really bad deal of colonization that is underneath all of the other deals on this land. So all of the real estate transactions that take place have beneath them a problematic deal. So I think as artists and cultural workers and arts organizations and progressive leaders in government, we're having to ask this question: what does land back look like? So the land trust kind of movement, I think, in part is attempting to both secure community governance for cultural sector, in our case, could be low-income affordability, but also recognizing that there's a role to be played in terms of creating reciprocal mechanisms for how we actually engage on a larger basis for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. So that's like kind of, we're asking those really tough questions, and ultimately we're looking for a succession model. We want to get rid of ourselves. We're hoping that there is this sort of collective entity that can do this in a good way and bring community governance along.
And so, in terms of what you've looked at, I don't want to take too much time because I do want to get to the other panelists, but what cities have you identified that have really done well with this model so far?
Well, and I think it, like every trend sort of out there, right now, the land trust movement is picking up steam. There's a Canadian network of community land trusts that's really focusing more on the housing end, but this creative land trust approach is something that's being taken up in London, United Kingdom, as well as in San Francisco. There's a group called Community Arts Stabilization Trust. Those groups have been able to sort of take on a flexible different roles in terms of community governance and financing. And so the American model, of course, is very different in context to Canada, the way that they have funding and a lot of foundations who are really leading the charge. So there has been success. And for example, there's a group in San Francisco. In San Francisco, real estate is kind of like Vancouver. It's just extremely expensive. That CAST helped purchase a building and basically held the building for them to repay a mortgage to them over the course of a 10-year period, providing patient debt as well as some financial support, capacity building, so that now they've become the owners of those buildings. So there's an opportunity there, basically pathways to ownership, long-term like ground leases for nonprofits. And then also, if you're of the chosen few who have your building, like the one I'm sitting in right now, owned by a municipality or a government, that being able to bring those onto a community balance sheet means that you can help unlock other real estate for different groups out there, rather than it being, you're sort of the miracle group that just made it. So, but it is a growing movement all across the globe. In Helsinki, for example, there's a very exciting group there working on it. In Seattle, there's one that's focusing really strongly on racial equity. But they all take on this form of collective ownership. And, just to demystify it once, there's no such thing as a land trust in terms of a governance, sort of legal model in Canada. Usually it's a nonprofit that really owns this real estate. And the land trust language is sort of new language being brought in around, community governance for that nonprofit.
Okay. And so let's move on to back to Halifax. Hannah, your situation with RadStorm has actually evolved quite significantly since we spoke last fall from my Globe story. So I was wondering if you could walk us through RadStorm's journey on how the team was able to secure its building first through community bonds and then philanthropy.
Yeah. So just really quick history on us. RadStorm is a collective of collectives, all that do different arts mediums. So there's a music collective, a food collective, which is an arts, but it's about feeding people, Anchor Archive, which is zines, Inkstorm, which is screen printing, a pottery guild, and also a photography guild, all kind of within. So since 2005, the different ones of those collective have existed. So we have a 20-year history. We just haven't all been together under one roof. But in 2018, we moved into the building we were in. And then at that time, we wanted to buy the building from the landlords that we had. And it's important to understand this building is on Gottingen Street in the north end of Halifax, which is very much the arts and culture kind of district of Halifax, and also very expensive real estate and rapidly gentrifying. So we started with just a fundraising model, just running concerts to help raise money for the building, gathering donations. But we really got serious in 2023 with looking for other types of ways to do this. So in 2024, we launched a community bonds campaign with Tapestry, which is a company out of Toronto, and they've done all sorts of amazing things. I would encourage people here to look into the community bond model. But doing a community bond model, kind of much like war bonds, meant that people bought bonds with us to invest in us buying the building for small percentage interest back each year. It's pretty comparable to a GIC in terms of the return. And that also, we had to get a business plan together and do all of that kind of homework to show people, how do we make our money here? How do we give back to the community through our various programs? Who are the people involved? All of that. So having to be prepared to do a proper bond campaign was what opened everything up. Because we are a semi-autonomous collectives that all work together, we also are on a consensus-making decision model all the time. So it's basically like active communism with small groups, and then we come together for the big decisions. So it takes a long time to make decisions, but it also means decisions are made more with the consent of everyone involved. So once we kind of got that plan together and we started getting the bonds sold, we then started having more interest in general from people to just give us money, including the city of Halifax. Halifax Regional Municipality gave us $100,000. Thank you very much, HRM. And that was largely due to that we are the only all ages music venue in the municipality of which most of the population of Nova Scotia lives in, or a very large part of it. And so that was a really important thing for them. We're also offering the most low cost artist spaces and resources. Like to rent a jam space is like $15 an hour. To use Inkstorm to go and learn how to screen print is like $20 for a workshop. So we work an extremely, extremely small amount of money and with very thin margins for us to run, but it gives access to the arts to people who otherwise have no way in this community to access the arts. So I think the number one way to get money is do good works, do good work in your community and become known for that and touch a lot of lives. And then when you go asking for money, it's a little easier. So we raised $186,000 in bonds and the $100,000 from the city. And then one of the sort of cornerstones of RadStorm is it has always been a queer organization that very much works to advocate for the rights of that community. And that has also included us being kind of an all ages group that has always included a group called the Elderberries, who are a senior group of queer people. And through that connection, through the Elderberries, we were connected with a man called Dr. Bob Frederickson, who's a local here. And he decided he wanted to basically give us the entire amount to buy this building as a legacy. He's an amazing man. He was one of the only doctors in the 1980s who would treat AIDS patients here in Nova Scotia, an absolute pioneer and just a wonderful person. But I don't think that we would have got that amazing gift had we not done all of the work and the professionalism around the bond campaign and the business plan and the fundraising. We showed people that we could do it. I think people sometimes, because of our unorthodox model, they think we're like a ragtag group of kids and we can't do things. But I think we really proved ourselves that we know how to step up for the project that matters, which was buying and securing the building for ourselves. And there were other buyers who were also offering a lot of money. So also thank you to the Schlecks, the landlords who are selling it to us. And they were also amazing. So this has been the work of a lot of people, but definitely recommend people look into the bond model, because community bonds allows your community to invest in what you offer and your service to keep you there and to keep you alive. And I was really shocked at how much people came out to buy bonds and to support us.
Thank you. Okay. And so, Ravi, let's talk about finding space for theater makers here in Toronto. How, I know it's extremely difficult. Can you tell me what about the current situation, how that inspired Why Not Space Project?
Yeah, happily. So for those who don't know, we're a theater company based in Toronto. We've been around for about 20 years. We're an international theater company based in Toronto, and we're also really interested in big systems change and ideas. And so in the last, from 2016 sort of to 20, before the pandemic, we were on a real growth trajectory. That's really rare in Canada for companies. So we were skyrocketing. We're now a $4 million company with no building, no physical assets. But at the time, we were like doubling, and we were just growing because we had a couple of large projects that were seeing a lot of investment. And because of that growth, everyone said, you need to go get a building. Go get a building. That's how you grow in the arts. And the prospect of that seemed ridiculous to us, because not only did COVID show that the model is flawed, but for us to do that, we'd have to raise $6 million, which we had never done at the time. And worse than that is the capacity that a theater that we could make would not satisfy the volume and the need that was out there in the community. At most, we could build a performance venue and a rehearsal hall, which most venues in Toronto tend to be, and that doesn't serve the community. And even worse, you'd have to charge a crazy rent for those spaces. So you're just asking the poorest people to, subsidize these expensive, endeavors. So we started going, look, well, what if Toronto was our theater? And what if we took all the empty spaces that already exist and repurposed them for the arts? And we started piloting in 2018 this Meanwhile Space project. And we discovered, so we were working with three kinds of partners. We were working with a community center in Little Portugal. We were working with a church, and we were working with a property developer who eventually joined our board. And it was with the property developer at Crest Point who told us about this Meanwhile lease, which is an existing lease between a city and property developers, where you can lease out a property before it's renovated, sold, or turned into condos, or whatever it's turned into commercial space. And the results of that pilot were astronomical. We focused primarily on BIPOC creators. And the purpose of it was free space. And how can we create a scenario where artists don't have to pay the burden and the cost of space? And part of the idea was, let's acknowledge the give that artists do for communities in terms of gentrifying neighborhoods, in terms of the asset that arts and artists bring to neighborhoods. How can we find a reciprocal kind of give back for that increase in value, let's say? So the pilot was really successful, and then we were going to go again. We got a few more spaces, bigger spaces, and then COVID hit. And we then started to do a bunch of research with Canadian Urban Institute and the School of Cities at U of T. And we looked into different business models and ways of how could we scale this? How could we do this? And it was really funny, because coming out of COVID, when we kind of reopened again and that space is available, worse and sadly, so much space was available because a lot of downtowns were empty. And so you have all these commercial spaces that are just sitting, doing nothing. And what was really fascinating was we got a big grant from Canada Council, this innovation fund. It was $250,000 to scale the business model. And what was hilarious to me was we were just basically creating a scenario where Why Not was going to become a property broker, and we were going to have a sliding scale of rent for properties that we would manage across the city. And I was like, wait, we need to pause on this. I feel like this isn't right. And then 3 months or so later, Artscape collapsed. And we were just basically duplicating that model. So we went back to Canada Council and said, hey, can we invert this? Because in our time in COVID in particular, we connected across the entire country, and there are so many artists who are doing this. There are so many artists who are of no resource and are just trying to figure this out in every community across the country because the need is so great. And we said, look, could we flip this on its head? What if we use this money that we have from Canada Council? Could we fund the people who are already doing this? Could we just basically fund them and let them serve their communities and see what the results of that study are? So we're just coming to the tail end of that study, and the results will come out in September. But what's been amazing about that is, I'll take a company like Aluna Theatre in Toronto, which is a small Latinx theater company that rents its own space. And they're a company that struggles with money. So they have to rent out their space, and they're like struggling to like get operating funds or private donations, et cetera, and they don't have access. So in theory, and it makes a lot of sense, and we're going to get the results and data to show this, but if we give them money and alleviate the stress of rent on them, we make them healthy. And then if they in turn give free space to the poor artists in their communities, we then make that community healthy. So the idea is to fund the base of the pyramid, because there's way more poverty than there is wealth in the arts. And there's actually a ton of money out there for space. So in Calgary, the Arts Commons just raised $440 million for this epic venue. A lot of buildings and cities see those buildings and venues as attractors for more investment. And what we're trying to say is, you're looking at this completely wrong. The entire community is the place where you want to actually invest in. It's actually a lot less money for a lot more impact, and it actually will develop healthier arts communities and therefore like the citizenry. And last point there is also, if you look at history, if anyone looks at the history of art, all art and innovation happens at that base level. It happens in the streets. It happens often, breakdancing comes out of the streets. Like any art, graffiti, you name it, it comes out of the streets. It doesn't come from the institution. No, I'm not knocking institutions. We need them too. It's not an either or, but it is widening the spectrum and recognizing the value at the base and flipping our mentality. And as Brian said this, and Hannah alluded to, this colonial mentality that permanence is the way to go, that a building, an opera, a single venue is the way to go. It actually causes a lot more problems. No, let's say we need them, but let's spread that money down, and we can actually have more impact for a lot less investment, and the arts could really mean something. And so that's the last part I'll talk about, and our study's hopefully coming out in September, and we're excited to share that. And as everybody said, we're just one of many, 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 many groups across this country who are really doing this in amazing ways.
Okay. This leads, I think, to a question I really wanted to ask everyone here, which is that all of the solutions we're discussing today are coming from people and organizations that are in the arts sector. This is, again, it's coming from the ground. And so I wanted to ask all the panelists, from your perspective, why is that important? Why is it important for these real estate solutions to come from the artists and the cultural community themselves?
I'll take a stab at this.
Great. Thank you.
I think there always has to be, the people with the ideas have to also be the people with the sweat equity. You have to be thinking and doing. We often say that RadStorm is a do-ocracy, because if people want to do a new project there, if they want to, and honestly, people do this all the time. People are like, I want to start a new thing here. Who wants in? And then, people jump in, volunteer with them. And we also, this also has made it hard for us to be a typical institution. People take on different leadership as per their skills and capacity at different times. We're kind of a headless dragon, which has also made it hard because people are like, who is your director? They want to see a really typical model, and we're not it. But I mean, we're an organization of artists by artists. So I think it's important, because when the models come from outside the community, they're not likely to understand the day-to-day operations of the community. And so it's not likely to be sustained. It's just kind of like, when a nation tries to go into another nation to liberate it, doesn't stick as often as when people liberate themselves. I think it's actually pretty similar.
Okay, Brian, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, for us anyways, we've been in a part of this kind of artist-run center movement, which is where artists really are, I guess, artistic self-determination is tied to cultural production. And that, of course, has changed and been more institutional over the years. But I would say kind of this core idea of workers' control is based in a similar kind of framing. And tenants control, which is, at least in Vancouver, because real estate has been so rampant and speculative, that kind of more extractive element of, renters paying rent has meant that tenants being a part of community governance is really critical. So when we say land trusts can also be the wealthiest people in the world. Like a trust is a way of controlling intergenerational wealth. But community land trust is, from our perspective, needs to have reputable governance and needs to have tenants involved in that governance. So it's similar in terms of the way artists drive culture and that the role that of institutions, and the reform of institutions in Canada that needs to happen should be coming through artists. So I think, it needs to happen with everyone at the table. We can't just sort of do it on our own type of thing, but you do need like sort of this watering hole approach of saying, hey, we've got a genuine kind of community and relationships happening, and people coming to the table, funders coming to the table, government coming to the table, not necessarily just chasing after those dollars, and artists kind of being a part of the picture at the end.
Okay. And this actually leads to something that Ravi and I were talking about a little bit, which are just the characters in this story of finding financing. And you alluded to this a little bit in your last answer. The idea of sort of the builders might be the ones who are the richest, sort of the richest. Inherently, they may not necessarily have a community of artists. And so I'm curious if you might be able to talk through these characters in this story and how they might be able to come a little bit closer.
Yeah, I think that's what's so key to this is building partnership and bridges and understanding the gaps to where thinking might be, and actually like where the cultural gap is. And I don't mean culture in terms of arts. I just mean in terms of a community culture. So that's why I think money is a big part of this, obviously. And with money comes culture. To be rich, to be poor, that there are cultural relationships and insecurity around discussing money and the weight of and burden of rent and mortgages, et cetera, and contracts. And so we're working with Choice Properties at the moment, and what's been really exciting is they're so curious, and it's really rare to meet, for me at least in my dealings, someone who's so curious about like wanting to connect with more artists and not knowing how, because it also isn't super clear. Like how do you find out about it's almost impossible for like my cousins who are not in the arts to know about shows that I'm in. Like, how do I buy tickets? Like, it's very confusing, the networks and the whatever websites. I'm not a very technical person either, but the information isn't easily accessed ultimately, and the volume of artists that are out there, it's hard to pinpoint who I should go to and how this should work. So when we're talking about community, people who are rooted in community, they often know there's always hubs. There's always people who are convening groups of people who are really best situated to facilitate and be the bridge of those different characters, let's say, and the cultural bridge to navigate, how do we work this contract? How do we deal with, oh no, like we got this thing for free and now the toilet doesn't work. How do I have the confidence to even talk about it? Like there's so much fear, there can be so much fear around speaking for your right. I mean, we've learned this so much in the arts community. It's hard to speak and defend your rights and speak for your rights when you feel that you don't have, and you're so grateful for the little that you're getting. And when we can create equity through this sort of bridge of cultures or hub of people who can translate, I think it just creates healthier relationships that are more equitable, and then help the actual pilot or the idea become more successful.
Okay. Hannah, I wanted to ask you another question that we had been chatting about. one of the reasons that artists need to be creative in finding solutions is that typical lending and financing doesn't work for arts organizations, particularly those without traditional structures of leadership, such as RadStorm. So, the question that you described to me is that you're often asked is, why can't you just borrow money? Why don't you answer that for the group? Because I think it's important for people who might not be familiar with the financing models that you're faced with.
Well, one, we have nothing as an asset to borrow against. I mean, now we do because we own this building. But until then, we had nothing to borrow against. I would say nearly every RadStorm member, I mean, I can't be sure, I haven't seen all their financials, but most RadStorm members live in and around the poverty line, or, maybe a little towards middle class. Of our, like, we have about 100 active members, but then we have about a peripheral 300 to 400 person organization that come and go for different things. And I would say it is generally a really working class organization. So we as individuals don't have money, can't go on our own credit to borrow for RadStorm, don't have any assets to borrow for RadStorm. And then to look at our space and to look at our individuals, we're a very visibly, there's a lot of queer representation in our group. There's a lot of disabled representation in our group. There's a lot of people who are very tattooed, pierced, and alternative looking. We just don't look like people that you lend $500,000 to. I am often the straight sort of face of RadStorm who goes out and does things because I'm the most normie looking person in the organization. And that's why I deal with the city and I do things like that. But yeah, we just are not, we don't look or sound like the type of people who get that kind of money. So I think that for us, it's a little bit of an image thing, and it's because we do a lot of punk and metal shows, and a lot of political groups use our space for meeting and stuff like that. So I would say maybe we court controversy with being that way. And then I think it's just hard for any arts organizations, to what Ravi was saying. I went to a retreat last year about philanthropy, and one of the things we were talking about there is we have to stop acting like we're beggars, like as if arts don't matter, like as if we should only get the crumbs off the table. Like, arts are life, arts are culture, art is what makes life worth living and cities worth living in. So I always try to encourage all the other members to ask like we deserve it, ask like we're entitled to it. That's really tough. But yeah, art and culture are what make places worth living in. People don't move to a city because it had such a great austere brutalist apartment building that was just built, or like it has 3 Walmarts. That's not why people move anywhere. So I'm always on the sense of entitlement first, see what you can get kind of model. But yeah, I would say it's hard when you're truly working class people to connect with money to borrow, and also to connect with moneyed people. Honestly, the only reason that we have that connection to Dr. Bob Frederickson is because he is a queer person himself who was involved with our organization for that interest politically. He also donated to the local Unitarian church because they allowed gay rights groups to meet in their churches in the 1980s. So he's really giving back, in a way that for what he has seen in his life. But yeah, in general, I would say it's pretty hard for people like us to be in the right rooms with people who would ever lend us money or give us money.
Okay. So we've got time for another question or two before we turn to audience questions. I'm going to turn this next one to Brian, but afterwards, the other panelists are welcome to answer. Brian, what role can governments play in easing the burden for artists when it comes to real estate costs?
Yes, there's a lot of different roles that government can play. I think the first is recognizing the role of the arts, not just, and I know this is going to sound a bit unpopular, but sorry, I'm getting calls. I'm not sure why, but we have a incredibly strong economic argument to be made for arts and culture. At least in BC, we have 155,000 workers in arts and culture, and an $8.3 billion GDP contribution. So we should recognize we have so much to give. And the other thing to mention is, we are a very clean kind of jobs. Our main resources are imagination. So I've been trying to say this to government as well. In terms of municipal government, certainly urban planning policies. So it's about putting arts and culture in the official community plans, such that any redevelopment, rezoning processes include arts and culture. Here at the City of Vancouver, there has been a no net loss policy, and that has been incredible in terms of protecting and preserving arts and culture spaces. One of the lowest hanging fruits for government is collecting data. We've had to do a lot of our own independent data collection or working with nonprofits, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be government of all three levels shouldn't be checking in on how urban space and health is, and not just urban, but rural spaces are impacting arts and culture. Progressive regulation is a big one within the municipalities. So because we're so focused around major development coming to town and regulating them heavily to make sure that community assets are coming out, sometimes when independent groups are trying to do social good by creating arts and culture spaces, the same types of levies and pressures and other types of regulation are put on those groups, just as if they're a large-scale developer. So creating basic progressive regulation, recognizing smaller businesses, arts and culture groups don't necessarily need that same level of regulation. Tax abatement, property tax abatement, that's something in the province of Ontario where there's been some property tax abatements for cultural groups. That is a major benefit, of course, to those groups, and particularly here in Vancouver, but most of Canada, we do a highest and best use kind of property tax classification, which means if you're in a very low kind of industrial building and the neighborhood's being rezoned to be higher density, effectively the city is planning the displacement of those people. And at the same time, the tax burden starts to hit those owners, which typically pass it on to the users. And so those tenants are often in a kind of bind. So if you can recognize arts and culture uses different types of buildings, and you know that density, if we want to preserve it the way it is, we can't tax it like as if it's going to be a tower. And then lastly, which is I think the main point I'm trying to bring across today, is this idea of investing in community governance and community ownership. So whatever that may shape or form that may take, which is individual organizations being able to purchase their buildings, access financing, social financing, like what Hannah's talking about. But of course, I would advocate for collective or community governance through something like a land trust to make sure there is a broader kind of growth mechanism to keep it moving in community.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. So we've only
Can
actually
I
got
just
about
build on
10
that?
minutes left. Okay.
Can I just throw
Yep.
one thing? I'll be
Yep.
quick.
1 minute.
1 minute. So I
Okay.
think there's a fundamental shift, also a paradigm shift the government needs to make, which is the notion that investing in one major physical art space, or that physical art space needs to be permanent, serves the community, because it doesn't. There are very few people who can access those big arts halls because and I'm saying this as an artist whose company went from creating 2-3 person shows to now a 40-person show that's on tour. That gap is massive, and very, very few people are able to jump that gap. We mostly work in small spaces. We mostly have the funds and resources to make small work, and people are very happy to do that. Not everybody wants to be big. It's okay to be small. And so rethinking how what arts means to the city isn't just the buildings. It's not just the AGO. It's the artist who's going to paint and make the work that will fill the AGO. And that's the person of course we need AGOs. I'm not saying we don't, but if we flip the paradigm and say, if we can get the money and the resource that independent artists need for space just to make their work, we would actually be doing such a benefit to the city, because more work would get made, more art would be created, more voices would be at the table. And I can say this with knowledge because of our study. The artists just feel good. You feel like you're an artist when you get access to free space. To Hannah's point, people don't just get this stuff. And so if a government can change its paradigm, because there's a lot of money out there for space, and flip it down to thinking about space as the network, not the physical building. It's like the relationship between the developer and the artist. That's a kind of space. If we think about the money required to offset the cost of space in different ways, we would actually have a lot more people who really, really need it.
Okay, thanks, Rami. All right, so we've got a few minutes left, and now I'm going to turn to Aubrey Reeves, who's been she has been collating questions from the audience that our panelists are now going to get a crack at answering. So
Great.
please take it away, Aubrey.
Yeah, we've actually had two very similar questions asking about how the concept of land trusts differ from a few other models. First, the Artscape model, and then also some other examples, the Edmonton Arts Habitat, Art Space, Winnipeg, Sea Space in Calgary, New Dawn Enterprises. They're all examples, Canadian examples of nonprofit real estate entities that have worked for many years to secure portfolios of affordable cultural spaces in a city. So how do they differentiate from this land trust model? So Brian, I think that would be for you.
Yeah, I think, you know, I can't speak to the specificities of each of those groups. Ultimately, I think the community land trust approach is about community ownership. So, and it's about community governance. So if you don't see tenants or users from those buildings on the boards, on the governance structures, then it's not necessarily a community land trust. It could be set up by government without having those relationships. It could be set up by an industry without those relationships. So I think that's the main difference, is it's maintaining that self-determination of the community groups. At the same time, like, the similar financial challenges can take place in a community governance setting. So part of it is usually land trusts will choose whether or not a separate building. So say you have multiple buildings on one balance sheet, land trust through the governance will choose, do we want to cure the debts of this entity? Let's say if it's underperforming or having challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a community governance setting, you would be able to ask that question and open the debate. And you'd have a lot of vested interest in that group. Whereas if it's kind of controlled by one organization without necessarily that same network of community governance, then you're talking about, you know, potentially linking the debt. And so sometimes the debt is, it's not as clear in terms of whether or not you're automatically over encumbering kind of the land trust or not.
Mm-hmm.
And those kinds of real estate organizations have to make those decisions. And sometimes a land trust could make that decision too. It's a very broad sort of framework. Last thing I'll just say is, I think one key difference in terms of the land trust we're trying to propose is we are imagining that nonprofits are the ones who hold relationships with community, and those are the ones who are really operating the buildings and making sure long-term community sustainability is there. Whereas the land trust is more of a financial and governance model. So an owner and a co-governance kind of model that helps with financing and helps to get those organizations into those spaces, but isn't necessarily choosing what goes on in those buildings. So you don't necessarily have as much like sort of finite day-to-day operational control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so a question for you, Hannah. Well, a grouping of questions about community bonds. How did RadStorm actually generate the interest to pay back to investors? So how did you disseminate the returns to investors? And can you expand on the concept of the bonds to buy space that ultimately the organization will own? And just a very small one, are community bonds strictly for nonprofits?
Okay, so really quickly, you do have a banking partner. So the money does sit somewhere gaining interest, very typically like any bank account will gain interest. Our model was you could buy a 1 year, a 3 year, a 5 year bond, or there was a 10-year option for people who wanted to buy a bond of $50,000 or more, and the interest came out yearly. So again, it is very similar to a GIC in that way, that it sits in an account and gains interest, and then it's paid out on a yearly model, and that it's locked in on an interest rate for these periods of time. And then the lowest people could buy was $1,000. We were allowing people to pool together to buy one $1,000 bond if they wanted to. So yeah, you are still using a banking partner. And in our case, we were using Tapestry, which is a company in between that helps basically their legal team helps you set up the bond agreements. They make the agreement with the bank. They're sort of an intermediary, but I would say a very needed one in that bonds are what they do. But it could be something that you could do yourself if you had those legal services and banking arrangements. And then I also saw someone was asking if they're just not-for-profits. Technically, no. Businesses can use bonds to raise money for themselves as well. So I do think, although we have stopped selling bonds because we don't need any more money, which is really weird to say. I believe our bonds page is still up on the RadStorm website if you want to look into all the details of our business plan and our bond campaign. And we will still be honoring the bonds that were bought of anyone who would like to keep them in. And we will be giving them back with no penalty to anyone who would like them back as well. So that's how that's going since we got gifted so much money. And then Tapestry is out of Toronto, and I would definitely encourage you to check out their website to see all the organizations that they have helped and how bonds work in more depth. I always explain it to people as like, think of war bonds and think of GICs, and it's kind of a mix of the two.
Okay, so final question really for all of you. What do you find are the greatest challenges when trying to work with real estate professionals, whether it's brokers or landlords, property managers or developers, to generate access to space for arts organizations? Maybe we'll start with you, Ravi.
Yeah, I mean, number one would be kind of what Hannah spoke to about just getting to know each other and like developing a relationship. How do I even know to say hi or to cold call you on LinkedIn that you'll respond? I think finding a way and finding opportunities for artists and developers to just meet is one thing. And then I think that it's really important. Something that we do at Why Not a lot with any partner is we sit and we have a conversation about values. Why are we doing this? What happens if the way we handle disputes is like this? What do you guys do? Here's what we value in relationships. We value conversations. We value these kinds of things. You value, okay. And we lay everyone's cards out on the table. Why are we doing this? And we always can come back to this why when there's a disagreement. And it's really important to establish those barriers, or not barriers, sorry, those what's the word I'm looking for? Values from the top, because those are always the things that will always come into question when there's a disagreement. So and then I think, like, speaking to trust, like, how do we just develop trust, get to know each other and collaborate together? Because at the end of the day, what I hear time and time again, everyone's trying to solve the same problem. Nobody wants empty space in a city. So the developer wants what we want what they want. How do we just come together, set the terms, and work together in a healthy way? And that's what we're hoping the results of our pilot, and also Arts Build Ontario is going to create a kind of meanwhile lease 101. If you want to do it, here's how you do it. So people are working behind the scenes to try to get people access to the ins and outs of how do we work together.
Great. Brian or Hannah, if you have any final thoughts on that question?
I'll just pass on it because bizarrely we had wonderful landlords, and then we had a wonderful person who helped us buy the building. Until we got those landlords in 2018, we had lots of issues with landlords and developers and things, because when you do loud musical shows, it's hard to find space. But shout out to the Schlecks, amazing landlords, and bizarrely now we're the landlords for the other part of the building, which is artist studios. So weird situation, but I'll leave it to, I'll send it to.
Yeah, in terms of relationship to landlords, like, most of our buildings are in the private market, but 3 of them are city-owned projects. So they're very different kind of relationships between government versus the private market. Our experience is that regardless of, even if you have, like, let's call it very nice landlords, ultimately, you know, for example, one of the buildings we're in, we have these short-term leases, you know, short-term, I mean 10 years. 10 years for us is still, there's usually a market exposure to the new rental rates at the next turnover. So we can do as much as we can. Like, I've bought boxes of chocolates, et cetera, to support, you know, make sure a rental rate negotiation is good. But it only goes so far, because there's expectations from their fiduciary, whoever's involved, to make sure they're generating a market rate. So we haven't really seen that as a solution in terms of working with private landlords. When it comes to nonprofits like the Chinese Benevolent Association, we currently rent from, there's a different dynamic there. We've been able to bring quite a few capital resources to upgrade their building, and that has created actually a long-term relationship that is far beyond the kind of network of property, and it's more in the family almost realm in terms of relationships, and that's I think quite unique with government. I would just say that it can be a quite strained relationship where it's really about providing services, and I would call it more like an arranged marriage. Like when we're kind of the junior partner in the arranged marriage, so there's a lot of like kind of heated conversations that need to take place on all sides to keep it moving. And sometimes we're put into the context of market partners in large developments where we're expected to sort of, in this very negative way, state what is failing and have all the parties come to the table, even to the point of kind of legal challenges. So, but I would say in terms of securing real estate, the city of Vancouver has been probably one of our biggest proponents and supporters, and continues to be so, even though it's kind of like they're the ones who've master planned the problem for us.
All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. A big thank you to our panelists, Brian McBay, Hannah Wood, and Ravi Jain, and to our moderator, Josh O'Kane, for today's discussion. It was really, really interesting. And many thanks to Power Corporation of Canada, presenting partner of the Business and Arts Speaker Series. I'd also like to thank supporting partners RBC and ACG. If you want to learn more about any business and arts programs and events, please head to the Business and Arts website for more information, or follow us on social media. The recording will be available in a couple days, and we look forward to seeing you all again at our next session. Bye-bye.